But when Katrina hit, there were no longer any court processing. There were no traffic tickets. There were no parking tickets. So there was no $35. There were no, and so there was no public defender office. No one was getting paid. And so there were somewhere between 8 and 10,000 men, women, and children who had been in the Orleans Parish Prison when Katrina hit. And I was assigned, along with this one other lawyer, to represent them. And suddenly I went from thinking about how do you train the next generation? How do you do right by one person at a time? To thinking, uh, how do you pick which of these 8 to 10,000 people? How do you find out who they are? Where are they? What do they need? What it was life changing in all kinds of ways.
Pam, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Happy to be here. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. It's been a while since we've gotten to catch up personally, but I was thinking of awesome people that I wanted to get on the podcast, and was recalling our when we sat at dinner together at a conference last year and had a great conversation. And you're obviously doing incredible work, so I was excited to have you on.
Yeah, we had a great time. So I was happy to hear from you, and it's fun to be talking to you, especially because a lot's happened since then. So there's a feeling you get in your gut when you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but I know it when I feel it. I guess it's a little like obscenity that way. You know it when you see it. What motivates me is feeling like what I'm doing is making a difference and changing people's lives in ways that are not just abstract but tangible. So like I could be sitting writing 10,000 law review articles. I'm not so interested in that. What I like is when I'm standing in a courtroom and I can change somebody's life, or I'm doing out in the field talking to lawyers about what's happening in their communities, and I get a moment where I'm like, okay, I can see a solution. What you described is, if that's the solution you want, let me help you get there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what motivates me is this feeling that you can make things better. I mean, I ascribe really deeply to the view that everyone is doing the best they can and everyone can do better. And if you can hold both of those thoughts at once, which is not always easy,
Yeah.
that's also very motivating.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And it sounds like, you enjoy the process as well. It's a process that, you keep energized throughout.
Yeah, in fact, I think I enjoy the process sometimes almost as much as I enjoy the end. I mean, it is when I was a practicing lawyer, it was the relationship with clients and this really deep love, not just of the work, but of the really there's an honor in being able to serve people when they're in crisis. The extraordinary trust that people place in you is itself motivating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it sounds like, when you were on the ground, you were these people's lawyers in some of the toughest time in their lives. That energy has sort of transferred. Like I can certainly imagine, having a rough day and be like, I got to go to work, but then you're going to work for people who are literally like, at such a tough point in their lives that there's nothing you can do but try your hardest, I would think.
Yeah, that's right. And it gives you two things happen. One is you do learn to adopt this attitude of whatever just happened in my life, I'm going home. I'm not staying in jail tonight. I'm going to go home. I'm going to see my family. I can decide what I want to eat. I can decide where I want to sleep. So you get to deeply appreciate your sense of choice. And then you also really have you have an opportunity to think as a single person, I could change somebody's life today. And that's enormously powerful. It can be very seductive and a little dangerous in that sense. You got to make sure you're keeping your ego in check.
What first got you interested in this? Like what even led you to law school?
So I'm a sucker for the underdog. And I was always going to either be a writer or a lawyer. And my mother convinced me that I lacked the self-discipline to be a writer. She probably was right. And then sort of all through, even in high school, if I saw something I thought was right, I did it. I mean, I was It was my first year of high school. I set up a Students for the Equal Rights. That's how old I am. A Students for the Equal Rights Amendment table. And when they
And
told
where'd
me
you
that
grow up, by the way?
in Atlanta, so it was a
Okay.
public high school in Georgia, set up a table and was told I couldn't do that, that that wasn't allowed. And so it's a true story. I also worked for the school newspaper and I was mad. And so I looked around and there were all these fire doors that were chained shut all around the school. And so I wrote an article for the school newspaper about fire code violations, called the fire marshal, and school was closed down.
Wow.
And I kind of learned that when you fight for something you believe in, you can't always get exactly the result you want, but you can make your presence known. And then in college, I had this very powerful experience of working on divestment. So I went to Dartmouth, which was poorly aligned with my politics. And I was involved in building shanty towns on campus about divestment in South Africa and disinvestment in South Africa. And that work led me to want to think about what was happening right there in the community around Dartmouth, which was one of the poorest communities in New England. And I started doing domestic violence work there. And by the time I graduated from college, I was really firmly convinced that what I wanted to do was some sort of public defense, direct services.
I mean, it's really incredible, and I love that story of high school where you kind of got back at the school in a way that worked. It's really thoughtful. And was there something about your parents or your upbringing or something that happened as a kid that like made you feel like this? Like, what made you want to put that table there in the first place?
I don't, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think about it a lot. I joke. I think you and I talked about this. My parents had what I would refer to as a mixed marriage in the South because my father was from a family of German Jews, very assimilated, been here since before the Civil War, and my mother was what they called the other kind, right? So her family came over, turn of the century. She was first generation on one side, and so it was a very culturally very different. And my mother was a dyed in the wool liberal, and my father was fiscal conservative, social liberal, both very very principled. And I think I was just raised by them to believe, particularly my dad, that if you see the right thing to do, then it's your obligation to do it. And I grew up in a synagogue that had been at the heart of the civil rights movement. So I went to the temple in Atlanta, which, have you seen Driving Miss Daisy?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so my father's a Driving Miss Daisy Jew, like that kind of,
Okay. Yep.
and that was my synagogue. And so the bombing that they depict in that movie actually happened at different years. But I would go to Sunday school and sit during religious services on if we went to services under windows that had been bombed out, and the rabbi who was my rabbi as a little girl marched with Dr. King. And every year, Ebenezer Baptist would come and do something at our synagogue. And every year we would go there. When we had the missing and murdered children crisis in Atlanta, which you're way too young probably to remember, but there was a bunch of young Black children who had gone missing, and there was a question about who had done it. We didn't go to religious school. We went out with other people and we looked for clues. People had, we were out looking
Wow.
for. It was a very social justice orientation towards what it meant to be Jewish, and to think about tikkun olam as not just an obligation, but as a privilege. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that was just part of how I was built.
Yeah, I mean, what a powerful community it sounds like you grew up around. And whether it was your parents pointing you in the right direction or just yourself to have the wherewithal as a young person to like, sounds like, make the most of that and learn the most from that you could.
No, I hope I did. I was so fortunate. Right? I mean, I so much more. Was born with so much more than other children are. I had parents who were able to give me so much more than other kids could have, and I felt that carried an obligation. I don't know that anyone ever said that to me, but I felt it. And of course, you and I talked about this as well. At some point, really thinking about my family experience and understanding it. I have this one half of my family that, fled the Cossacks, and okay, with all the stories you hear from the old country in that sense. And I have this other half of my family where some of those people enslaved other people, and that was mind blowing to me. How do Jews enslave people? They
Yeah.
did,
Yeah.
and
It's mind blowing
and
to me. You don't ever think about it like that. And yeah, I mean, I haven't, I know that I know authors that have covered Jews during the Confederacy and stuff like that. So I haven't read their books, but I imagine it covers some of this.
It does, and but it's not something. It's very, I don't know. I've never read anything that really helped me understand it, and I've spent a lot of time digging through the archives at the Georgia Historical Society, and it's a very strange sensation. I have correspondence from I think he's my fifth great grandfather, with Jefferson Davis, and it's just,
Wow.
it was so shocking to me, because I was, we could go off and have a whole conversation about the doctrine of chosenness, but I had this idea, right, that being Jewish meant certain things. It was a very naive approach, right? But when I was a kid, and it really, really radically shifted my understanding, to a point where I understand that how some people see Judaism may be as a matter of birth or genetics or whatever, but in many ways, I think it's a matter of choice. And you look at, if you were a Jew and an enslaver, then I'm not sure you're really choosing to be Jewish.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's honestly, it's hard to imagine. And so, I mean, do you feel like part of all this work that you've done in your life is sort of reckoning with that?
Now, it does not take a very significant Freudian analysis to say, sure, maybe. But I think, I don't know. I never thought about it that way. I always thought about it as, here's work to be done that needs to be done for people who aren't being treated justly, and I'm good at it, so I should go do it. I mean, it felt that way. But you may be right.
So, back to Dartmouth, you're getting involved in the community, working in domestic violence. Like you were seeing sort of how real life gets, I would imagine. Um, and, how did that affect you? And, did you know from day one at college you were going to go to law school, or was it like something in that experience that led you there?
I was moving in that direction. And there's no question that the thing I got two things out of Dartmouth. Now I'm gonna have to say three. Three things out of Dartmouth. I got some very, very deep friendships. I got a fabulous education with professors who I knew on a first name basis. I mean, a very, very rich connection to people who thought and really worked with the stuff of ideas. But the other thing, I learned how to play hardball. I mean, we had an administration that was very conservative. I was not. Um, and I began to be really interested in the ways in which you use power. And so, or how you generate power. So, for example, when I was in college, again, this is 1980s, there was no women's resource center. It was a very fratty campus. When I got there, it had only been co-ed 10 years of my first year. So it was and I remember we wanted a women's resource center, and there was a lot of pushback about, if we had a women's resource center, you had to have a men's resource center. And
Isn't everything a men's resource
well,
center?
that was kind of our reaction. Yes, that's exactly right. But this was, I don't know, it was a very big
Right.
debate. And I remember the trustees were meeting on campus, and we wanted to talk to them about a women's resource center, and they wouldn't talk to us. Like, we just don't have to meet with you. And again, this is like teaching yourself how to get things done. A couple of us went around and we got women to write out handwritten descriptions of things that had happened to them on campus, including
Wow.
an art history professor who used to put up slides of Playboy cartoons in the middle of his lectures just to see if you're paying attention. All the way down to people being, sexually assaulted, raped, waking up in a fraternity. I mean, everything that happens on
Yeah.
college campuses. And we all handwritten, so it was very powerful. And then we made photocopies. We stuffed them in manila envelopes, took them over it with a cover letter saying, we'd very much like to meet with you, and we think these stories are newsworthy, but we did want to give you an opportunity to respond first. And you'd be
Wow.
shocked at how fast we had a meeting. And
Wow.
learning how things like that matter, learning what motivates people. And there were some people when we met with them who were genuinely horrified, had not understood, wanted to address the problem. And there were some people, I'm sure, who were just meeting with us because they wanted us to go away. But those experiences really got me interested in the uses of power. And then when I went, my in between college and law school, I went to Massachusetts to work in Boston for a year. And I lucked into, through a temp agency, a job working as the assistant to the chief counsel for the Massachusetts Committee for Public Counsel Services, which is a fancy way of saying the statewide public defender's office. And I worked for the state chief counsel, the woman who was in charge of private representation when they needed, private lawyers to come in. I worked on a training program because this was 1988 about how to talk to your clients about AIDS and HIV. And I fell in love. I fell in love with the work. And after that, there was just no going back. I was hooked.
Yeah. And then through that experience, did that give you an even deeper desire to go to law school, having seen how much you could help you?
By then I was going. And again, I mean, I did not get in the places I was waitlisted pretty much everywhere, and was very irritatingly persistent. The woman at NYU, which is where I went to law school, asked me please not to call her right anymore. And but I wrote to them. I said, look, I'm on the wait list. Somebody is going to drop out in those first few weeks. I'm moving to New York. I'd like to audit a section, and hopefully that way, when someone drops out, I'll be ready. And at that point, it was what I want. I was I was shockingly pushy, and again, from a position of enormous financial stability, in the sense that I knew that if I went to New York and didn't get into law school, there would be somebody was going to pick me back up. I'd find a job, and I wasn't going to have to worry about going hungry, and so I could afford to take that chance.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate how it keeps coming through that, if you've found something that you think was the right thing or needed to happen, you've just found a way to make it happen. And it makes me glad that you got into the line of work that you did, because if you were using that in nefarious ways, we could be in a rough spot right now.
We use one's power for good and not evil. Well, not everyone always
Yes.
thinks I'm using them for good, but I do.
Well, there's always going to be opponents and haters.
Yeah.
And so, after law school, did you go straight into being a professor, or what was your next role?
So I went to the federal public defender in the southern and eastern districts of New York, and I worked as a public defender in that system for 3.5, 4 years. I did a brief and remarkably unhappy stint in private practice. I'm not built really to work for other people. It's not. I'm just not good at it.
How quickly did you learn that?
About the first 3 weeks. Well, because you go work at a law firm, and I've been trying cases, and you work at a law firm, most of the partners either have not tried a case or they've tried very few. And so, and also, again, early 90s, the most powerful advice I got from somebody was, when you get there, insist that you do not know how to make coffee, you do not know how to use a fax machine, you do not know how to make copies. And but I learned a lot. I learned how to write. I learned how to write well. And then I went from there into teaching. So I taught 2 years at Washington and Lee, mostly running a clinic for women in prison at the Alderson prison in Alderson, West Virginia, which is where I realize I'm blinding you. I'm sorry. At a later date,
No, you're good.
Martha Stewart ended up there at some point, but Alderson, West Virginia, and I worked there. And I had the experience of seeing all these women who'd been convicted of crimes, some in the federal system, some in the state system, who were being housed in this federal facility. And most of them, they had no legal recourse. The time for filing an appeal had passed, and it was day after day of sitting with people and listening and saying, I am so sorry, there is nothing I can do. And sometimes what you could do was explain why there was nothing, and sometimes you could help them figure out how to make sure that their sister was able to take possession of their washer. And then there was a little while when the law changed about termination of parental rights, where if you were unavailable to your child for, I think it was 17 out of the most recent 24 months, I can't remember, but some large chunk of the last 2 years, the state could terminate your parental rights. And we saw really quickly, again, the role that race was driving. We saw women mostly white women who were from Wisconsin state prisons. As soon as they got to the jail, they got to the prison, they hadn't even given birth, and the state was starting termination proceedings, the white babies. We did not have that problem with the mostly black women who came from the District of Columbia. It was again, really profound marker of the way in which race shapes the experience people have of their family lives. and the way the state thinks about children.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was there for 2 years and then moved to Tulane, where I ran the criminal clinic for a while, and then went into the classroom eventually, and then went from there to SMU, where I am now.
So when you talk about running the clinics, in these universities, is that, do you teach while you're doing that? Is that its own thing? I just am not too familiar with that.
So until very, very recently, it was the practice to let lawyers, no pun intended, go to law school, never do any practical work, and then go out and just be lawyers. Not what you would want from your surgeon, certainly not what you should want from your lawyer. And so law clinics are designed to give students practical training. And I believe at their best, they do so in the context of providing legal services for people who otherwise would not get them. What I did at Tulane was I ran a criminal justice clinic. So we used to take cases in the criminal courts in New Orleans. And it's a mix of the students doing the representation and you supervising. And as the case gets more serious, the student involvement decreases and the faculty involvement increases. But the goal is to let them do as much as they can, as well as they can, as long as they are giving the client everything the client deserves. And I did that I did that up until Katrina hit in 2005, and then sort of everything changed.
Yeah. Well, that is really important work, and it helps everyone. From the student perspective, to get real life experience. That same in business, it goes such a long way to actually have experience on the ground. Books can only teach you so much. So
Yeah, that's right. And look, it was enormously important work, and you in some ways you judge your success not just by what happens to your client, but where do students land and what do they go on to do. And it's a little bit of a door thing, right? I mean, in its
right,
own
yeah,
way. So
generation to generation.
yeah,
Yep.
that's right. And then, so Katrina happens, and I was appointed along with someone over at Loyola Law School to represent all of the Orleans Parish inmates who had been left without a lawyer. So
Wow.
you remember the pictures of all those people in orange jumpsuits on the overpass.
Yep.
So pre-Katrina and for a while afterwards, the money for public defense in Louisiana came from a fines and fees system. Every time someone was convicted, there was a $35 assessment that went to the public defense. So set aside the rampant conflict of interest, because if you acquitted everybody, you would have no paycheck.
Right.
$35 a case is not enough to provide anything close to meaningful representation. But when Katrina hit, there were no longer any court processing. There were no traffic tickets. There were no parking tickets. So there was no $35. There was no public defender office. No one was getting paid. And so there were somewhere between 8 and 10,000 men, women, and children who had been in the Orleans Parish Prison when Katrina hit. And I was assigned, along with this one other lawyer, to represent them. And suddenly I went from thinking about how do you train the next generation? How do you do right by one person at a time? To thinking, uh, how do you pick which of these 8 to 10,000 people? How do you find out who they are? Where are they? What do they need? What it was life changing in all kinds of ways. But one of them was that it required such a radical shift in perspective um, that it really, and that's how I landed where I am. Is it moved me from thinking about individual representation to systemic.
Yeah. And that's, such a intense thing to be thrown at someone, to have that. So how did you select, and how did you meet individuals?
Probably poorly. The answer was at the beginning, I didn't even know I'd been appointed. I evacuated, and there were a whole bunch of lawyers from out of the state who came and tried to find where all the prisoners had been sent, because they were sent to prisons all over. These were all pretrial detainees, by the way. The Orleans Parish Prison is actually a jail, but the name of it is the Orleans Parish Prisons. These are all pretrial detainees. And they were sent to little jails and prisons all over the state. And so another group of lawyers had gone through and tried to find everybody and interview them. But we still didn't know a lot about them. And so the first thing we tried to do was get a list of who was in the jail. Sheriff wouldn't give it to us. For anyone who's watched Treme, which is based on that experience. If anyone has watched it, not the way it happened. That's fiction. But what happened was the sheriff wouldn't give us a list of who was in the jail at the time, and the public defenders didn't have one. Turned out that the New Orleans public defender had 43 part-time lawyers, 2 computers, and a little Harry Potter office under the steps in the courthouse. And they couldn't give us a list of their clients because they didn't have one. The lawyers were part-time, and they were assigned to work in a courtroom, most of them in 2 courtrooms, in the morning. And in the afternoon, they could work on their private cases. And so they just took whatever case rolled in the door. They didn't have a list. Some of them might have a file or 2, but basically that's the way it was. And so eventually what we did was we had 2 things happen. We had some very good people in the Department of Corrections who would pick up the phone and call me on the down low and say, I got a guy here, I'm pretty sure, but and we would get lists from them of people that were in just on misdemeanors. In my banner day, I had 364 people released on a single day. Just walked in with the judge, here's a list. I mean, it was nuts. It was because these were people some of these were people who had been arrested on drunken disorderly charges the night before Katrina fall, which is itself insane, and were still in jail months later. They were serving more time than they could have if they'd ever been sentenced.
That is mind-blowing. And just as a person that, values my freedom, that's one of the reasons that I work in criminal justice reform is I just can't imagine some of these situations that we're putting fellow humans in. So to think of those people just being in limbo for months is just so sickening.
Yeah, it was. I will tell you that the treatment they experienced is so horrifying. I'll tell you 2 stories. One I know firsthand. The other one has been published. So, they were the sheriff refused to evacuate, and ultimately state officials had to come and pull everybody out of the prison and again, to jail. In some places, people were in chest-high water. They all thought they were going to die. They thought they'd been abandoned. The ACLU did a great report on this, and they all thought they'd been abandoned. And they loaded these folks up on buses, and they took them to what was a prison, an actual prison, about an hour and a half away called Deason. And they had, again, you have 10,000 men, women, and children. And they take all the men and they put them on a field. And remember, you've got 17-year-olds, you've got 50-year-olds, you have gang members, you have kids who are drunk and disorderly on a college trip, right? You have people who are from rival gangs. You have people who are giving evidence against each other. They're all predators. They're all in a big field. And when the time came, no guards, no separation, no nothing. And the way they fed those people, these human beings, was they got forklifts, and the guards would stand on these raised kind of flatbed forklift things, and they would throw peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and water bottles down into the crowd, and it was so horrific.
I mean,
and
that's something out of like a nightmare in a movie. Like it's mind-blowing.
Yes, it is. It is. And so here's the second story I will tell you is ultimately we decided we had to get a handle once we cleared through kind of the names of the people who were in jail, and we could figure out who was arrested on a misdemeanor and needed to be just released right away, who had already served all the time they'd been sentenced to. We still had thousands of people. I think it was like 6,700 people that we had to figure out what was going to happen. The women were mostly resolved at that point. There'd been a bunch of pregnant women that were up at Angola. They'd been released. But we have all these other people. There's no evidence. The evidence room flooded. There's no courthouse that's open, so you couldn't try a case if you wanted to. And we decided we were going to go just pick one local jail that was holding a bunch of Katrina prisoners. And we would go talk to the people there and say, what's your experience been? What do you need? And just treat them as an unscientific sample so we could try and figure out what to do next. And so we got up there, and the very first day I was there, and I can tell you the story because he and I did news stories about it. He's consented to my telling. Went up and I met a man, he's about my age, a guy named Greg Davis. And I said, tell me about why you're here. And he says, I don't know. And, lots of people say they don't know. And I said, well,
Yeah.
Why do other people think you're here? And he said, no, I don't know. And I said, oh my God. Okay. So I go back to New Orleans with his information and I look things up, and here's what I managed to figure out. At the time that Katrina hit, And go back a week before. Katrina makes landfall at the end of August 2005. Mid-August 2005, he owes fines and fees on a misdemeanor offense. He has 400 and some odd dollars in fines and fees. And he's supposed to come to court every week or two to make a payment or explain why he can't make a payment. And he gets arrested. I don't even remember what for. He gets arrested and he spends a couple of nights in jail. And then the DA's office decides we're not going to prosecute this case. We don't want it. But the thing is, while he's been in jail for that night or two, he's missed his court date to pay his fines and fees. And because there's no lawyer who's responsible for representing him, there's nobody to say, yeah, Judge, he missed his court date because he was in jail. So the judge issues a warrant for his arrest. So the jail holds him. And because he has no lawyer, because the public defender's office at that point really, again, they were representing people only when they showed up in court, really. Nobody says anything. So Katrina makes landfall, and he's in the Orleans Parish Prison over 400 and some odd dollars of fines. And that's where I found him in February of 2006. And so so it's heartbreaking that there's no lawyer. And what happens next is sort of worse. Is I call him and I tell him and you know I tell him I figured it out. I'm gonna get you home. We talk a little more. And he actually told me about that night at Dixon when they were throwing the sandwiches. He said he stayed up all night and all you could hear, he said, where he was and I said, what do you mean? And he said, oh, that was people making shivs.
Jeez.
And he said, he was not a young man then. I mean, he was compared to the people who were there. And so we're talking. I said, don't worry, you're going to go home. I get a court order, release him forthwith. We go back the next week because we're visiting. Again, we're going to cover everyone in that jail. And he's still there. And I said, Mr. Davis, what are you doing here? He says, I don't know. I said, I'm going to find out. So I go to the warden of this particular local jail and I say, I don't understand. I got a forthwith order. Did you receive it? Yes, I did. Why isn't he home? Well, there wasn't any room on the bus. And I said, what bus? He says, the bus. I don't know about any bus. Come to find out that when they had rescued people from the Orleans Parish jails, they didn't have any place to take them. And none of the other jails in Louisiana wanted to take the Orleans Parish prisoners, who were overwhelmingly Black. And they ended up taking them only with a written agreement that said that those people would not be released in the place where they were incarcerated. They would have to be brought back down to New Orleans to be released. Now, mind you, there's nothing there. It's a wasteland.
Yeah.
And there's a bus that goes around the state a couple times a week to pick people up and bring them to New Orleans. But the priority was people who had not yet been convicted or who were having court dates. And so people who were due to be released were literally back of the bus. And and so it took another court order and a litigation. But, that was, that's one of, 10 million stories.
And knowing that this awful story is like one of so many is just like, it makes me sick, honestly. Like there's so many kind of privileged people like me that don't know some of these things that have gone on. And I've learned about the system over the last decade, but it's sickening.
Let me tell you something. I lived and worked in that city. I went into those criminal courts every day, and I had no idea what the level of practice was with the public defenders because they look good in court. And look, everybody is doing the best they can, and everybody is trying to do better. They were doing the best they could in a bad system. And because they had not, most of them, ever seen a good system, they didn't know what it could be like. They didn't have a model for doing something different. And when the dust started to settle, I was appointed to the local public defender board and worked on legislation to create a state public defender and went on that board. And many of the lawyers who had been engaged in the old practice went through this very difficult process of recognizing that what they had been doing was not enough. And some of them couldn't make the change, but many of them stepped forward and said, okay, I want to do this the right way. And they became some of the most amazing lawyers I've known. They just needed a chance to do it right. They needed someone to say, no, you don't have to take 500 cases. No, you don't have to go forward when you're not prepared just because the judge says so. Here's a way to do it. They needed to feel that they were entitled to do the right thing. They were going to be supported if they did the right thing.
That's huge. Well, I can understand why seeing all of that chaos and mess, led you to a new endeavor where you thought you might be able to affect the system as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, it's an enormous privilege to get to do what I do. I mean, I'm the luckiest person in the world, and I have the best job in the world. In 2016, 2015, 2016, a guy named Doug Deason, who's a Dallas-based conservative philanthropist, and approached what was then the Charles Koch Foundation and some other folks and said, I want to start a criminal justice reform center at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas. So they did that. And it was unusual for a Charles Koch funded center at that point because they didn't have an identified faculty director or a specific mission. It was just, we're going to do something about criminal justice reform. SMU went looking to hire a tenured faculty member to run it. They recruited me. I came. And we've been able, with Doug's support, with the support of Stand Together Trust, Arnold Ventures, along with a number of smaller individual family-based foundations, philanthropies, a couple of grants, we've been able to really, I think, tackle the problems, and comes directly from that Katrina work. Tackle what the problems I saw there systemically, across a large number of jurisdictions, which is parenthetically why I'm in Mississippi today.
Yeah. So in terms of how it was pitched to you when you were being recruited, did it turn out to be what you expected? I mean, it sounds like you really enjoy it. So was it better than expected?
It was certainly different. I didn't know what to expect. I had spent my entire career, I never had any grant money. I know I was every year, if you teach a clinic, every year it's you and 10 new law students or 8 new law students. And maybe, if and you have maybe a deputy. I had a fabulous woman who worked with me who took over after. But it's like you're a partner in a law firm, except for all you have is first year associates. There's a limit to what you can do. And so I didn't know what to expect. And I got there and I had no management experience. I didn't know how they work. I'm still not good with Excel, but I know how to use Excel. I didn't understand how to run a budget. And so I had to learn a lot, but I also had to figure out what the mission was. And that was both exciting and terrifying.
Well, I can attest to learning on the fly can be very effective if you're forced to learn. And where did you land on the mission, and how has it evolved? And it's been almost 8 years?
Almost 8 years. Actually, the mission has not evolved that much. I knew I wanted to do something with the right to counsel. And so the very first thing I did was get a group of indigent defense researchers on campus at SMU the first month I was there. I mean, I started planning it before I actually was in the job, so that we could talk about how to begin moving that research association about what makes for high quality indigent defense. How do you do it well? How do you serve people well? Was the very first thing we would do. And I did it deliberately because I wanted to frame it as a public defense experience. I was very concerned at that point that I would not be able to sustain funding for a project that really only focused on indigent defense. So we decided to focus on some prosecutorial practices as well. Again, specifically on things like how do prosecutors make their charging decisions? Why are people in jail? How can we resolve some of these cases earlier, coming out of that Katrina experience? Right? Why had no one looked at Greg Davis's file the day there was an arrest warrant issued? Right, that question is the one that really frames my work in many ways. And then a couple of years later, I realized that there was this enormous gap that all of the criminal justice conversation, public defense conversation, prosecution, all happening around big cities. And that in small and rural and tribal communities, we call them star communities because you could call them like frontier communities. You could add that, but then you'd have farts, and that wouldn't be very attractive. So we do small, tribal, and rural because it sounds nice. But in small, tribal, and rural communities, we just were leaving them out in the cold. And so we began to focus on those areas. So I don't know that it's changed so much, except that I've learned to be very, very disciplined. We do front end work, meaning early stage process. We don't do evidentiary issues. We don't do sentencing reform. We worry about all the things that should happen on day one when a person is arrested. We worry about how to help prosecutors make smart, prompt decisions about who needs to be in the system. We worry about how you deliver the right to counsel in rural areas where there is a shocking problem of legal deserts. We're working with folks in Colorado actually on this problem, and we do research as well on what works because we always want to make sure that just because we think it's the right thing, we want to make sure it is the right thing. We prove it out. So what we have really I have learned to simply say no to work that is meaningful and that would be in many ways sort of stabilizing in terms of being kind of a nonprofit within a nonprofit, because it's not what we do. That we're good because we stick to what we do and we've become experts in it. And I have been so fortunate as to gather, hands down, the best people in the field. They are so good that they don't need me, which is, I mean, they just don't. Like if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, I am thrilled to say that everything would still be okay. No, I mean, it didn't
I
used
mean,
to
that's
feel
a
that
good
way.
thing as a manager, as somebody that built something. That is a nice thing to be able to say, and commend you for your discipline, because I do agree that becoming an expert in one area and not getting your focus clouded can be beneficial. I mean, I say this as a serial entrepreneur in a dozen industries that
Yeah,
is not good at
but
that,
you
but
but you do that well. I mean, you do that well. I know that I could go do all of these things and do them well at the time, but my mission is to
right.
affect lasting change. And to do that, yeah, you have to pick the
Yeah.
thing, that you can do.
If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. One issue that it seems like it's popping up throughout is, overload of people, of data, not enough staff. Are you guys thinking about or starting to incorporate AI into your work to hopefully speed up some of these situations?
So it's funny you say that. We hosted an event on campus last year about AI and prosecution, although ironically, most of the conversations we had were about defense. And we're going to be, some of my staff attended recently an event on AI and defense, and we continue to have those conversations. So we're very much thinking about that, and talking to public defender offices about how they are using AI to support their work. There are real legal, logistical, and ethical challenges in using AI in lawyering, particularly lawyering for poor people. More of what we're trying to do is think systematically about what are the processes and procedures that we believe can do early downsizing. And there are places, high volume systems, that can really use AI effectively to point them in the direction of possible solutions. So, for example, you could imagine a large jurisdiction that was keeping good data, which is a different problem. If you had good data, you could imagine some machine learning on which kinds of cases are most likely to be dismissed, and then feeding that information back to prosecutors so they're not wasting everybody's time and energy, right, bringing those cases in. Or you could imagine that we're not there yet on the data side. What we're doing instead right now is we're focusing on a combination of pilot studies and pilot evaluations and randomized controlled or quasi-experimental design studies where we can. If you're interested, I can give you some examples, but we're finding that, yeah.
I mean, I think it's very interesting, and I'm just like imagining back to those days in New Orleans where you had all these prisoners, and if again the data's not great, but even if you could synthesize the data you had to tell us here are the ones that are most likely to be let out the fastest, and I don't know, are you familiar with recidivism?
Yeah, I know recidivists. I know Clem. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and Clem's gonna be on the podcast soon, and
You have to ask her about being in the circus.
Okay. Oh yeah, I know she was in the circus. I'm definitely going to bring that
It's
up.
my favorite
I
recidivist
appreciate the
fact.
tip. I appreciate the tip. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope that they and organizations like them can help continue to both improve the data and make sure that it is being utilized in a good way.
I think they can. I think the trick though is as with anything, are you asking the right questions? So I'll give you our example. So again, our focus at this point is on day one. What are the things that should happen day one? Day one, you should have a lawyer help you apply for counsel if you don't have a lawyer. Day one, you should see a judge. Day one, your lawyer should be able to make arguments about whether you should be in jail at all. Day one, someone in the DA's office should be looking and saying, is this a case at all? And if it is, do I want to prosecute it? All those things should be happening on day one. They happen rarely, if ever, on day one, and in many places may not happen for weeks. What we have found is that in part tackling that problem has been challenging because for decades criminal justice has conflated two very important questions. So if you are arrested, prosecutors have to make a decision, am I going to take the case? So they have to accept it or decline it. And then if they take the case, they might ultimately dismiss it. So that's a dismissal. They've agreed to take it and then they've changed their mind, or you've worked out, you did a program and now they're going to dismiss it. But there's a difference between declining a case, I'm not going to touch it, and dismissing it, putting it in the system. There's a judge and there's a lawyer. Most criminal legal systems do not distinguish between those two. So if you look at the data, declinations and dismissals will be lumped together. Declinations happen early. Dismissal is the end, right? It happens at the end. And our point is you should be focusing on declinations, not dismissals. If you can't distinguish them in the data, you can't begin to try and solve the problem.
Right.
And so we're working on that. And then the other thing we're doing is, so I'll give you two examples of how we're
Yeah.
thinking about this. In Mississippi right now, for example, Mississippi has a system where it's very data sparse, and the public defender system is county by county. The state has done some incredible work in the last couple of years requiring that people are represented from arrest to disposition. They have an unprecedentedly strong rule, but implementation is challenging, right? Because people pass these rules, they don't necessarily hand you a check to implement with. So what are we doing? We're here, talking to people in rural north central Mississippi. We're going to bring a pilot office in, assuming the Mississippi legislature funds it, which is what I've been here talking about. And we're going to put in lawyers to do day one representation, represent people all the way through. But as we're doing it, one, we're going to require the counties not to cut the salaries of the people who are already doing the work. We're not going to hurt people. Two, because these are small town lawyers, we're not going to hurt them. Two, we're going to randomize the way we take cases. So we have an experimental design and we can see what impact we're having across time. So we're going to randomize and collect the data. And if it works, we'll try and take it elsewhere. And if it doesn't, then we'll stop and ask why. The other example I can give you is the Dallas County DA's office, which has, I still can't believe we did this. We did a randomized controlled trial in the Dallas DA's office. In Texas, they have 90 days that they can hold you on a felony while they're trying to decide whether to prosecute you or not. And just sit with that for a minute. 90 days, and at the 90th day, they can say, I am so sorry, Jeffrey, we are not going to prosecute you after all. Have a nice day.
The human
Mississippi, by the way,
element,
there's no timeline.
yeah, the
None.
human element and the trauma associated with all of that is just something that needs to be taken into account. It's so inhumane.
It's so inhumane. But the Dallas County DA cares about that. And so they have a system, a very large office. They have their most senior and experienced lawyers decide which cases to charge. And then once they've decided it, they hand it off to the trial lawyers. So we went in and said, how is this process going? And it turns out it was taking them on average 10 days longer to decline a case than to accept it. And they have a very high dismissal rate. So we said, how can we help you make some charging decisions? And we worked with them. We can go in there. I mean, we had our own ideas. They didn't like them, so we didn't do them. And we agreed on an intervention. We took all of the victim cases, all the assault cases, and in that system, complaining witnesses were not hearing from a victim advocate until after the case was charged. unless it was a domestic violence case where there's a grant, or I think elder abuse cases. But anything else, no victim outreach at all. So not great for people who are crime victims. Not great for people who have to make decisions about whether to charge a case because they don't know anything other than what the police have said. So we raised money, we brought in 2 full-time victim outreach staff. We put them in the charging unit and we randomized their services. And if they got a flag, this was one of the cases selected for treatment, the folks that were doing the victim outreach would call and they'd find out, one, can we even reach this person? So some people don't actually want to be found. They may make a complaint. You can't find them, it's going to be hard to prosecute and convict somebody. If they find them, is this person credible? Is the story they're telling making sense? Can we get some information to give to a prosecutor so they can make better decisions? Do they want to prosecute? We were stunned, by the way, in running this experiment at the number of people who said, oh, no, I don't want to prosecute. I wanted them to get mental health or substance abuse treatment, and I didn't know how else to get it. Shocking number of people told us that. And then, do you need services? How can we direct you to services? And what we discovered is we doubled the declination rate in that office on those assault cases, doubled it across every category of cases, misdemeanors, felonies. Didn't matter whether people black or non-black, which is the way the data is kept. So that's what we worked with. We doubled it with that simple experiment. Now, they're still upside down. They're still taking longer to decline than to accept. But that's an office that wanted to figure out, could they do it better? We tried something, it worked. And now we're writing up the results and we're going to empower them to go and try and say to the county commissioner, you need to give us money so we can do this for everybody.
That's tremendous. That was what my next question was going to be. So how long have you guys been doing that with this office, and what's the sort of timeline on them being able to show what they've done?
So we ran the randomized control for a year. We just got the first results on 2 questions of interest, which were how long to make the decision about whether you're going to charge. And we ran that both from arrest and from when the prosecutor got the case. It turns out there's a very long lag between arrest and the prosecutor getting the case, which is something important we learned that we're going to try and deal with. And the second outcome of interest was the likelihood of declination. So acceptances versus declination. So we, as I said, we doubled the declination rate. We also made significant decreases in the amount of time it took them to make decisions, both for accepting and declining. We are still waiting to get jail data so we can try and come up with some rough number of jail days that we were able to save. That's a harder measure because of some complications and where people get booked. Dallas has 35 municipalities. And so if you get booked in one municipality and then they bring you to the Dallas County Jail, we can't count the municipal days because they don't try. It's been very complicated. But we've got the first set of outcomes of interest. We are reporting them out. We actually have a grant report due on Monday. Dallas County DA's office already has some sense of the results. We will be presenting them at a national conference on research, artificial intelligence, data security, and transparency for prosecutors. And we will be publishing them in 2 different formats. One in an academic journal, because it's an RCT, it makes sense to do that and have it vetted so that it has that stamp of rigor. But 2, we do these kind of very user-friendly publications to educate other people in the field about how they might try something similar. And so we'll have that available. And then we'll also write up sort of a summary of report so that the DA's office can take it when they go through their funding cycle. You'll be unsurprised to hear I already have other DAs asking me to run this experiment in their offices. But that's been incredibly exciting.
In those instances, are you interested in taking on others if you can find the money for it?
Sure. If I can find the money, and if I can find the right, how do I say this? Not every office is going to lend itself to the exact same experience. They have to be willing to be flexible about,
or to change. Yeah.
Right. In other words, if it's so, this is what's called horizontal prosecution. One unit makes the charging decision, the other unit disposes of the cases, makes the decision. In an office that's vertical, where the same lawyer carries the case all the way through, we might choose to do the randomization differently, for example. So we'd have to have some conversations. And the other thing I would like to do that we were not funded for in this round, but I would like to do, is I would like to have the resources in an office where two sets of lawyers are handling the cases to ask the receiving lawyers, did you notice the difference in the cases that went through? What was the experience of having a case where someone had actually spoken to the complaining witness versus when they hadn't? And I would love to be able to see, I mean, intuitively, I think it has to be the case. Well, it doesn't have to be. Intuitively, I would suspect that the conviction rate has gone up in that category of offenses. And I would also anticipate that the overall, that the conviction rate has gone up and that therefore also the dismissal rate has gone down, which doesn't, across time, doesn't have to be true. At any given moment in time, doesn't have to be true because cases open and close at different times, but that
Right.
cumulatively both things would happen. But we'll see. So yeah, we would love to do something like that again.
Yeah, I guess I'm just imagining if there's a philanthropist listening that is in a different state but knows, about a fit that there could be here. Like, is there an opportunity for that philanthropist to come to you and say, I'll grant some money in order for you to help this department?
Yeah, 100%. And if we're not the right fit for it, we are always happy to spend time helping figure out who is. The other thing I'll say is that we would love to find a public defender component for this. So you can't, as a public defender, I think it's very difficult as a public defender ethically to randomize something once you know it's working, right? If you don't know it's working, it's fine. Once you know it's working, you have an ethical obligation. But the kind of pilot we're running in Mississippi, where we're simply taking a random selection of the cases, our pilot office, those are also enormous opportunities for philanthropists who want to do reform where it's not just research or just practice change, but it's combining them. There are enormous opportunities in public defense, and there are places I think where you could combine them both. So in an ideal world, you take these two experiments we're doing, you would have, because you have the public defender coming in on day one, and because you have a prosecutor getting information about the case early, you would then have the public defender and the prosecutor meeting early and trying to resolve it. And I think you would see an acceleration of outcomes there. That's the big dream.
Yeah,
Actually,
that
the big
makes
dream is
sense.
that the whole system is just smaller. But
So, you mentioned starting this center about 8 years ago. I'm curious, like, how many people work for this organization? How much has it grown?
well, so we are now at 15 full-time people, which is just blows my mind. We have a policy team that includes two litigators. One of our policy lawyers has also has a master's and is a statistical expert as well. We have a national campaign director who's a lawyer for our day one campaign. We have three full-time data scientists and a postdoctoral student, the postdoctoral fellow who is a geographer, and he does our ArcGIS mapping of lawyer scarcity, which is what we're getting ready to do in Colorado. And he's going to help me advise the Colorado Access to Justice Commission on some work they're trying to do to improve to deal with lawyer scarcity problems in large swaths of Colorado. And then we have a communications person, a marketing person, someone who's a COO, but also an expert in family defense for which a lot of public defender offices have to do, representing parents who are parental rights are being threatened. An office manager, and then we have wonderful law students and undergraduate students, and I mean, it's amazing. I pinch myself because I don't know how this happened.
Well, it sounds remarkable, and I know that they were fortunate to get you when they did. It's clear you're building something really tremendous, and I don't necessarily think these people are listening, but at least to inform the people that are, to those that are dismissive of work in the criminal justice system, that are privileged to think, oh well, everybody, if you're in the system, you're bad. Like, do you ever come across those types? Like, and what do you say?
Yeah, I do, and I say two things. I say one, if you can, close your eyes for a minute and remember what it's felt like every time you were driving and you saw blue lights. just because you thought you were going to get pulled over. I don't care who you are, your heart's pounding. And then imagine that you get taken out of your car and you're handcuffed behind your back and you're taken down to the jail and you're booked. And think for a minute about all the things you were on your way home to do. And then imagine that you're going to be in jail for 48 hours before you see a judge or a lawyer. And ask yourself, who's giving your elderly parent their medication? Who's meeting your child at the school bus? What's happening to those kids when no one meets them? Because I promise you, temporary foster care is not pretty. What about your medications? What do you need? Are you going to have a job when you get out? Take that moment and imagine what's happening. And then layer onto that the idea, imagine that only 1% of the people in the criminal legal system have been falsely arrested. Imagine only 1% of the people. It's a bad lab report and it's not in fact drugs. And already one person is one too many. But if you extrapolate that out, you don't have to go past those first 48 hours. And what I say to those people, particularly people who think of themselves or who like to think about law and order and safety, and what I say to them is what distinguishes us as a nation in many ways is that we do not believe that the state has the right to kidnap its citizens and hold them indefinitely and incommunicado without explaining the charges, giving them a right to a defense and a chance to be heard. And all over this country right now, that's happening. Right now, there's an 18-year-old sitting in a jail in Mississippi who was arrested a year ago, and there's still not an indictment. And I don't care what he did. It should make us ashamed that that happens in our country, and it should make us committed to doing better. And for everyone who's worried about that, you want government out of your business, you keep it out of theirs.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really powerful way to have people look at it, and the amount that lives can change in those 48 hours and all the people that one life being detained can affect is pretty remarkable. And it makes me think back to, you met my sister briefly last year, and she's working on what's now called the Redirect Collective. It's alternatives to juvenile detention in Charleston, South Carolina, where we grew up. And some of these in that system there, some of these kids are held for over a month before anyone figures out what's happening to them, and they lose their place in school. It ruins their entire life.
And it's, and again, you just think about how terrifying it is. Anyone who has ever accidentally, if you've ever been in an elevator when it stops and you think it's stuck and you're trapped, for most people, that's that sense of being trapped. Can you imagine being a child and having your entire life, your physical safety, what you eat, when you sleep, who you talk to, who touches you, being handed over to strangers? I mean, it's terrifying. And from all your work on marijuana and cannabis reform, we still have people filling our jails for crimes that are no longer crimes, or because of predicate crimes that are no longer crimes, or because they have arrest histories for things that are no longer crimes. And we have to do better.
We do. It's a lot of work to do. I really appreciate the example you guys are setting and the change that you guys are pushing forward. It means a lot for the whole system.
Well, thank you. We are, like I said, I am so extraordinarily fortunate, and the idea that I get to live a life where I do work that I believe in, and where every night I can put my head down on the pillow and I feel good about what I did, is extraordinary. And I have been blessed with such unbelievable support. And I put a shout out here to the folks who fund this work, because I do want to say that before I did this work, I'd never raised $1. No experience, none. And I thought there was this, I don't know what I thought it was, but I've gotten to know the folks, many of the folks who fund my work, and the grants officers who work for them and the tremendous work they do, and what an enormous act of faith it is to write that check. And I am so conscious of what an enormous leap of faith they've taken with me, that I I would encourage anybody out there listening who's on my side of this, who does the work and thinks, oh, well, I just don't have any money to do it with. I will say this: there are so many people out there who understand that they have been blessed with resources and who want to help you succeed and who want to believe in you. Don't be afraid to ask.
That's an important message, because I think, especially in our current society and the divisiveness, people think, oh, like every successful people is evil. Like a successful person is evil. Like it's obviously not the case. And there's plenty of good people to go around for all the negativity that we hear about. That's what this podcast is about. And I think, like, you work with people. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle if you're both trying to do the same thing. Do you agree?
Oh, well, not only do I agree, but look, I work with Doug Deason. So Doug actually flew me to Mississippi this week because we had a meeting with the governor to talk about this pilot project. I disagree with Doug about an awful lot of things. He disagrees with me about an awful lot of things. Awful lot. And they're going to be more in the next 4 years that we disagree about, probably just because I think we're moving very fast now. And that's okay. I love Doug, and I believe he loves me. We do this work because we believe in it and we like working together. And where we can work together, we do. And where we can't, it still brings kindness to the table.
I'm seeing, there's an outcome that a lot of us didn't want to happen, but I'm seeing a lot of people that didn't want it to happen are reverting to hatred and reverting to, vitriol, like, around all of this. And I think the most important thing is that we come together around the things that we can. And I think, seeing you and Doug are a great example of how people that you might not expect to work together can, if they're working on the same things. And, stand together often quotes Frederick Douglass, and that, work with anyone to do good and no one to do evil, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. That is, yes. And I think that's where Stand Together comes from. And look, I think that there are probably times and moments where you have to say, my disagreement on this is so strong that I can't, that people have those moments. But I think you're right. And I think, look, I taught I was at Tulane, which is students are all almost uniformly very progressive. And they were there. This was, 2016. They're there because they want to help rebuild the city. They're not. And, I walked in the morning after the 2016 election. Everybody's in black. Everybody's eyes are red and swollen. And all I could say to them is, whatever you're feeling right now is what half the country has been feeling. That's how we got to this result, right? They may not express it the way you do, but people wouldn't have made this choice if they didn't feel so profoundly disaffected and so profoundly left out.
I'm curious, though, do you have any other passions outside of criminal justice?
I am absolutely incredibly passionate about reading. I mean, I am a compulsive reader. I love the theater. I was lucky enough to be in New York earlier and London just a few weeks ago and be at the theater in the West End. I love live theater and Broadway.
What do you like to read?
Mostly literary fiction, but you name it, I'll read it. I mean, so I'm just finished reading a lot of Sigrid Nunez, the Vulnerables, the Friend, who I adore. I just finished not too long ago James, the Percival Everett book, which is just, if you haven't read it, it's a retelling of the Huck Finn story from Jim's perspective. It is. When I read a book, I sort of inhale it. I mean, if I read a book, I read it that day, beginning to end. I read very, very fast, and I read immersively. I don't. I mean, when I was a kid, the burglar alarm would go off. I'd be sitting in my room reading. I wouldn't have heard it. James was a book that was so profoundly moving, but also so deeply painful that I would find myself having to put it down sometimes. Not that it wasn't also funny and warm and touching, but the way in which it conveys the utter horror of chattel slavery, of what it is like to have no ownership over your own body, was so raw and painful that there were moments I had to put it down. I mean, I'm thrilled to have read it, but there were
Yeah.
those moments. But yeah, I'll read anything, almost anything I can put my hands on. But recently, that's the hands down the best thing I've read. I did like the Heaven. Have you read the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, James McBride?
I have not.
You should. Okay, Jewish immigrant family in rural Pennsylvania, but it will, parts of it, having been in South Carolina in Charleston,
Okay.
may feel familiar. Just the it's he was the one who wrote the Good Lord Bird, the John Brown.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
familiar with that.
yeah, a wonderful book. So yeah, I read all the time. I'm a very poor amateur gardener, and have become recently. I think I've just hit that age where I've become recently fascinated by birds. I'm so embarrassed to say that, but I put a bird feeder in outside my office window, and have become so riveted by watching them that I've had to move my desk, and because I'll find myself just looking at them.
That's
But that's
amazing.
not so much of a hobby as is it probably a way of just taking a break. And I
Yeah,
have
I
a
mean, it gives you perspective.
it does. And then I have a long-standing meditation practice, which is something I'm very passionate about, and in these times I find essential. I try to live by an expression that someone once told me. I have two of them actually. One is, if you don't think you have time to meditate for 20 minutes or 30, you probably need to be meditating for an hour. And the other one is, sometimes you need to say to yourself, don't just do something, sit there. And for me, that's an important one. I have a tendency to pop off when I feel strongly about something. And sometimes remembering, don't just do something, sit there for a minute.
Yes. I've had to teach myself that one for sure.
Yeah, well, this is a good historical moment for it. Being strategic about how to do the right thing is going to be important.
Well, I've just got a couple higher level questions for you that I asked toward the end, and then we'll be good to go. But, aside from family, if everything were to end tomorrow, whatever that means to you, what are you most grateful for or most proud of?
Most proud of my two kids and the things they've done and the things they've overcome and the things they've accomplished. Most grateful for having had the chance to be in this world, and to have been lived in a time and place where I was free enough to do what I wanted, and have been blessed with parents who were able to put me in a position to do that.
Maybe this plays in a little bit, but the last question I like to ask is, if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
Well, okay, so one thing in the world, boy.
Yeah, the entire world. You snap your fingers, changing a rule of society or the world. Everything's gonna listen to your snap.
I don't know. I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, take your time.
Can't think of a rule. And I wanted to think of a piece of technology. I was like, well, okay, could is there a piece of technology you could use? But I actually think the thing that I think would be the most impactful would be to find a way for every person to have that switch in their brain where, before they act, they think through empathetically how it's going to affect other people. That's not a rule. It's just a way some people's brains work and some people's don't. If everyone did that,
Change the way people think, 100%. I mean, I imagine it as, there's somebody up there that has a dial that can turn up the empathy in society. That would go a really long way.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. Turn up the empathy and slow down the action.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful perspective, and I'm so thankful you were able to join me, and Just love the work that you're doing. Always happy to lend a hand how I can. And I'm sure many listeners are super inspired and they want to know the best way to support you and your impact. How can they do that?
Sure. Well, easiest way to reach me is to reach out to me at SMU. It's my email address is, I don't know if you want me to give it here, but I can drop it. I'm P Metzger, Metzger at smu.edu, or you can go to the Deason Center, Deason Center at SMU, and send an email. I believe that partnerships, whether people are volunteering or finding financial support, work best when there's a shared passion. And so, if you want to be involved, let's talk about how and why. I like to talk to people about what motivates them and make sure that we're engaged as a team. I mean, of course, people want to write checks. I take those too. But I think that the work is most meaningful when it's a shared endeavor. And we are always looking for people who want to know more. We welcome students, law students, and researchers who want to volunteer and get involved as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for the amazing work, and I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Okay.
Thanks for checking out this episode of People Are the Answer. For more information, go to peoplearetheanswer.com. Please like, subscribe, rate, whatever you can do on various platforms. We really appreciate the support. And if you're interested, check out my other podcast, The Late Game Podcast. You can learn more at thelategame.com. Thanks.